Diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. In this lecture, I will discuss the structures and functions of the diencephalon, brainstem, and cerebellum. The diencephalon, highlighted in orange in the image, is sandwiched between the inferior regions of the cerebral hemispheres. The diencephalon lies deep within the brain. The diencephalon includes the epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus. These terms are bolded in the image to help you find them. The diencephalon provides relays and switching centers for sensory, motor, and visceral pathways. This means many sensory, motor, and interneurons synapse in the diencephalon, and a determination is made regarding the information signal. The epithalamus, shown in the image, partially forms the posterior roof of the diencephalon and covers the third ventricle. The posterior portion of the epithalamus houses the pineal gland. The pineal gland is an endocrine gland. It secretes the hormone melatonin, which helps regulate the body's circadian rhythm, our day-night cycles. This is our first time to mention that the brain controls our body not just through nerve signals, but also through hormones. The thalamus, highlighted in orange in the image, is a pair of oval masses of gray matter that lie on either side of the third ventricle. The thalamus is composed of about a dozen thalamic nuclei, which receive signals from all conscious senses except olfaction, the sense of smell. The thalamus is the principal and final relay point for incoming sensory information that is processed and then projected to the primary somatosensory cortex. The thalamus filters the information and sends only a small portion of the sensory information to the cerebrum, enabling us to filter out background sounds and sights when we are focused on something else, such as blocking out family voices and noise while studying. The hypothalamus, highlighted in orange in the image, is the antero-inferior region of the diencephalon. A thin, stalk-like infundibulum extends inferiorly from the hypothalamus to attach to the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus has numerous functions that are controlled by specific nuclei. These functions include control of the autonomic nervous system, which regulates heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and digestive activities. Control of the endocrine system via hormones that control the anterior pituitary gland and the production of antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin released by the posterior pituitary gland. Regulation of body temperature. The hypothalamus is the center of the limbic system, controls emotional responses such as fear and rage. The hypothalamus controls food and water intake by regulating hunger and thirst. And the hypothalamus is involved in the regulation of circadian sleep-wake rhythms via control of the pineal gland. Remember to press pause and give yourself time to answer the questions. Make your brain work. The brainstem connects the cerebrum, diencephalon, and cerebellum to the spinal cord. Three regions form the brainstem: midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. The brainstem is a two-way passageway for all tracts extending between the brain and spinal cord. This means that axons of nerve fibers, both axons coming up into the brain and axons leaving the brain, pass through the brainstem. The brainstem contains many autonomic and reflex centers required for survival, and it contains nuclei of many of the cranial nerves. The midbrain, highlighted in orange in the image, is the superior portion of the brainstem and is composed of several structures. The cerebral peduncles are motor tracts and are located on the anterolateral surface of the midbrain. Descending axon bundles of the pyramidal system, the corticospinal tracts, project through the cerebral peduncles and carry voluntary motor commands from the primary motor cortex of each cerebral hemisphere. The substantia nigra is a cluster of cells with a black appearance due to melanin pigmentation. Nigra means black. Its neurons produce dopamine, a neurotransmitter involved in movement, emotional response, and the ability to experience pleasure and pain. Degeneration of these neurons results in a deficiency of dopamine that is responsible for the loss of muscle control in Parkinson's disease. The cerebral aqueduct extends through the midbrain. The tegmentum is involved in postural motor control and contains the reticular formation. The tectum contains two pairs of sensory nuclei, the superior and inferior colliculi, which are collectively called the tectal plate or corpora quadrigemina. The superior colliculi control visual reflexes that enable us to turn our head and eyes to follow an object, such as a football player running down the field. The inferior colliculi control auditory reflexes that enable us to turn our head and eyes in the direction of a sound, such as when we hear a loud bang. The cerebral aqueduct, tegmentum, and tectum are shown in the image, which is a cross-section of the midbrain. The pons, highlighted in orange in the image on the left, contain sensory and motor tracts that connect the brain to the spinal cord. The pontine respiratory center helps regulate the skeletal muscles of breathing. Many of the structures in the pons are shown in the cross-sectional image on the right. The most caudal portion of the brainstem is the medulla oblongata, which is continuous with the spinal cord. The medulla oblongata has sensory and motor tracts that connect the brain to the spinal cord. All communication between the brain and spinal cord involves tracts that ascend or descend through the medulla oblongata. The pyramids house the motor projection tracts called the corticospinal or pyramidal tracts. The pyramids are named for the pyramid shape of the cell bodies of the neurons. Most of these axons cross to the opposite side of the body at a point called decussation. As a result of the crossover, each cerebral hemisphere controls the voluntary movements of the opposite side of the body. The inferior olivary nuclei relay proprioceptive information to the cerebellum. The image shows a cross-section of medulla oblongata structures. The medulla oblongata contains several autonomic nuclei that group together to form centers that regulate functions vital for life. The cardiac center regulates heart output. The vasomotor center regulates blood pressure by controlling blood vessel diameter. The medullary respiratory center controls breathing rate. Other nuclei are involved in the reflexes of coughing, sneezing, salivating, swallowing, and vomiting, as well as receiving somatic sensory information, that is, sensory information from the body. The cerebellum is the second largest part of the brain and is similar in structure to the cerebrum. As shown in the top image, the cerebellum has three regions: a convoluted cerebellar cortex of gray matter. The convoluted folds are called folia. Inner white matter called the arbor vitae, because its distribution pattern resembles the branches of a tree, and deep cerebellar nuclei of gray matter. As shown in the lower image, the cerebellum has left and right hemispheres. Each hemisphere has an anterior and posterior lobe separated by the primary fissure. The vermis is a narrow band of cortex between the left and right hemispheres and receives sensory signals regarding torso position and balance. The cerebellum coordinates and fine-tunes movements. It does not initiate movement. The cerebellum ensures that skeletal muscle contraction follows the correct pattern, leading to smooth, coordinated movements. The cerebellum stores memories of previously learned movement patterns. The cerebrum initiates a movement and sends a rough draft of the movement to the cerebellum, which then coordinates and adjusts it. For example, the controlled, precise movements a musician makes when playing a stringed instrument result from fine-tuning by the cerebellum. Without the cerebellum, the finger and hand movements would be choppy and lack coordination between the two hands. The cerebellum receives the proprioceptive information from muscles and joints and helps maintain equilibrium and posture. The cerebellum receives motor plans and sensory feedback that enable the cerebellum to check if the motor plan was carried out correctly. If the action was different from what was intended, the cerebellum generates an error-correcting signal that is transmitted to both the premotor and primary motor cortices, which then issue signals to motor neurons to correct the action.